You know, I'm starting to notice a pattern. A little while back when Helluva Boss was still on Season 1, episodes 5 and 6 came out within about 4 months of each other, and they were both amazing episodes. I personally consider them to be some of the best episodes produced by the show, and have both at a 9 out of 10 on my list. And from what I could observe from the fandom online, the general consensus was similar to my personal feelings. It seemed like everyone just really liked these episodes. However, after dropping these two absolute bangers, it was followed up by an episode that was pretty good, but a noticeable dip in quality from its predecessors, Episode 7. A lot of people really like Episode 7, because it's still a fun time and it has some character development stuff at the end, but I don't think it can be denied that when this is all said and done, people are going to remember Harvest Moon Festival and Truth Seekers before they remember Ozzy's. Flash forward to a few weeks ago. Season 2 of Helluva Boss is already 2 episodes deep, and both of those episodes have been very good and were very well received. I thought that both were pretty good, and a more than serviceable start to a new season. Granted, I didn't like them nearly as much as I did 5 and 6, which were really something special, but these were still strong episodes. Because of this, me and everyone else were eagerly awaiting the next episode. The anticipation was heightened by everyone wondering what scenes from the trailer released all those months ago were going to be shown. So the episode finally drops, and it practically mirrored what happened last time. The episode was good. It had solid humor, provided character development in the form of showcasing Moxie's childhood, a good action scene, and basically every other thing that we come to expect from a generally good episode of this show. Despite all that though, this episode pales in comparison to the two that came before it. I feel the same way about it as I do Ozzy's. It was a good episode, but all around a forgettable one that will fade into the background of discussion about this show in the future. However, I recognize that it's a bit unfair to judge this show mostly just by comparison to the best the entire rest of the show has to offer, so I'm going to try and review it in a more standalone way moving forward. After a lot of waiting, we finally got an episode dedicated to Moxie. This episode essentially does the same thing for Moxie that episode 5 did for Millie. It shows his family and general background. The main difference is that Moxie's origin story is given much more depth than Millie's, because we get to see how he met Blitz, how his dad is a mafia boss who offed his mom, and a very necessary montage of him with his ex. Anyways, Moxie's dad, Crimson, is a mafia guy, and he tries to force Moxie to marry his ex, who he believes to be independently wealthy now. If the ex, whose name is Chaz by the way, looks familiar to you, that's because you've seen him before. He was featured in the trailer twice, which was a terrible decision in my opinion, but more on that later. Then there's this really stupid B story thrown into the episode involving Chaz being excessively horny and trying to fuck everyone, including a musical number that made me want to stick a gun in my mouth. That ends with him fucking and then kidnapping Blitz, a plotline that goes nowhere because he's freed from the trunk by Millie a few hours later, and then she does everything else for the rest of the episode. So Crimson tries to do the forced marriage, but Millie finds out and shuts it down before it can happen, after a fight scene coupled with the first original Helluva Boss song that I've actually enjoyed since Ozzy's. After they leave, and yes, they literally just leave with no further discussion, there's a scene of Crimson throwing a knife at a portrait of Moxie, implying that he wants revenge. Add him onto the pile of one-off villains, I guess. Oh, and side note, this episode decides not to relegate Millie to nothing more than a background role, and she gets some screen time as well, in addition to the aforementioned fight scene. Turns out that Chaz was her ex-boyfriend too, and she hates him with a passion for the whole episode. I actually kinda like that they included this, because it gives Millie a little more substance than just an inconsequential side character, without interfering with the central Moxie stuff. So that's about it for this episode. There really isn't much to this one in my opinion. The most substantial bit is definitely the character development for Moxie, which lasts probably about 2 minutes out of this 25-minute long episode. We also get to see a good amount of the greed ring, which is pretty good too. I personally love setting development, especially for a show that takes place in a world as interesting as this one, so this is a huge plus for me. Despite how little there is in the actual episode, I have a surprisingly large amount of things to talk about, so let's start with that. The episode starts off with the breakneck pacing, back-to-back jokes, and random nonsense that we've all come to expect from the first 5 minutes or so of a Helluva Boss episode. I know that description just sounded critical, but I promise I don't mean it as a bad thing. I don't mind episodes being started this way, honestly. I'd only mind it if it was just random unfunny shenanigans to fill out the runtime and had no actual content inside it. This episode doesn't do that, fortunately, and we find out a few things in these scenes, actually more so than usual. One is that Millie has an ex who she absolutely hates, which we'll find out a few minutes later is also an ex of Moxie's. Little nitpick, while this is all happening, the Harvest Moon Festival music plays in the background, which I feel like wasn't really necessary. I think they only included it because it's one of the only things that Millie has in the entire TV show, so they felt obligated to use it while she's on screen. They did the same thing in episode 6 during that fight scene, but there it actually fits, while here it kinda doesn't. Moving on, we find out that Blitz is speaking with a client who wants to meet the IMP in person over a non-murder venture in Hell, and sends a helicopter to pick them up. As I mentioned earlier, we see more of the greed ring as they fly over it, and I'm all for this setting development. Out of all the things I enjoy about Helluva Boss, I think the physical setting that it takes place in is one of my favorites. Like all good fictitious worlds, it seems unique in every aspect, and like an interesting place to visit. Even though what more we see is brief, I'm still appreciative that we got to see more of it. During the flyby, Moxie laments on his dislike for the ring, and he mentions that he grew up there. Then he suddenly realizes that they're actually flying directly towards his childhood home. This is made clear to everyone else after they're greeted on arrival by Moxie's father, Crimson. He starts kissing up to Blitz almost immediately, and this is starting to look kind of familiar. Anyways, it's almost immediately clear that Moxie's dad is a villain due to his slightly off presence, weird music, and this sinister expression. This will be important for later. So they go inside, and like 2 seconds later, we're introduced to Chaz, Millie and Moxie's shared ex. This guy is an obnoxious, insufferable asshole to the point where I have a hard time watching him on screen, because he's basically just a walking sex joke dispensary. Seriously, every line this guy says has to be sexually charged, like the writers had some sort of weird quota to keep up with or something. Not only that, but this obnoxious Minecraft YouTuber intro music plays in the background almost every time he talks, which I legitimately can't stand.
What is up, party people?
On top of that, it really only feels like he's here to manufacture conflict that brings Millie into the story somehow, because if you removed him from the episode, it would play out almost exactly the same. They could have had Crimson try and force Moxie to marry anyone, maybe some random rich girl who actually has wealth to her name, or something like that. Hell, that would actually make more sense in the story because Crimson is shown to be homophobic, so it would make sense for him to try and marry Moxie off to a woman instead of facilitating a gay wedding and filling his dining room full of dicks. That would have been a lot better, I think. Yeah, I don't like Chaz, and I think he represents almost everything I don't like about Helluva Boss. Anyways, this is how Millie and Moxie find out that they shared an ex. Also, side note, Millie pulls a knife on this guy almost every time she physically can, but still allows this to happen. Gotta keep Millie inconsistent, I guess. So we get a quick montage of these two falling in love. Strangely, we don't get one for Millie, even though he dated them both. I can't tell if this is because the episode would have run too long with one, because the writers think Millie doesn't deserve more screen time, because they want to keep Millie's past vague for future episodes, or because they really wanted to show more of Moxie's bisexuality, because that's what this fandom fawns over. Take your pick for reasoning, but I still think she could have gotten one. Come on, guys. I love Mox and all, but I also want to see Millie in a setting other than ass-kicking Southern lady for once. God, it just occurred to me how negative I'm being about this episode. This shit doesn't even bother me that much, really. It's just kind of mildly annoying. I'm going to try and ease off the biting criticism a little bit. So right before that montage and during it too, we find out that Moxie's dad is evil because he's a mafia boss, and that Moxie was supposed to enter that life too. We also get a bunch of scenes from the 2022 trailer, and their exclamations. The scene with the "tell your dad it's a salesman" sign was literally just a 2-second instance of Chaz living up on Moxie, which is honestly a little bit disappointing. Like, if you're going to use a scene for the trailer, why this one, and why with this asshole? Was it just to throw people off? Actually, if so, well done. The second trailer scene that we get has a lot more to it, as it's the bank heist scene. The context behind this one is that, yes, they were doing a heist together, and that Chaz abandons Moxie after it because it goes wrong. This leads to Moxie getting thrown in prison, where he meets up with Blitz and then joins the IMP, which is far more interesting than any other scene featuring this douchebag. Many fans have been waiting to see how these two met for a long time, myself included, so yeah, this whole scene makes that dumb romance montage actually worth it. After it's over, Millie tries to knife Chaz, they do the unnecessary Harvest Moon theme thing again, and then they go to dinner. During dinner, Crimson reveals that he doesn't actually want to do business with IMP, just Moxie. He tells them that Chaz is being brought into the family to pick up the jobs that Moxie left after leaving. He also tells them that the reason that it's Chaz is because apparently he came into some money. Something I find annoying is that watching the scene after knowing that Chaz is lying kind of just makes Crimson look like an idiot for being so ready to bring Chaz into the family without verifying his wealth at all. Remember that whole marrying Moxie off to a random rich girl idea I had earlier? That actually works better here too, because if this fictional girl was actually wealthy and was like the daughter of one of Crimson's mafia friends or something like that, it would make Crimson look like less of a dolt for allowing this random hillbilly he doesn't even actually like into his mafia family. Just throwing that out there. Anyways, Crimson says that the reason that all this involves Moxie at all is because there's supposed to be a ceremony thing the next day where he releases all of his assets in the organization. Immediately following that, Crimson says this.
Say, why don't you stay here and get some rest? We'll have the ceremony tomorrow, and then you will be free to leave.
And this is how Moxie reacts.
Prepared? Yes, sir.
This pisses me off, and this is kind of the first domino to fall in a long line of instances in this episode where Moxie is either an idiot or everyone else's bitch. I feel like this show is having a hard time accurately portraying Moxie as of late. Moxie is supposed to be a softer, more physically weak man whose strengths lie in his intelligence and loyalty. He uses his mind to do his job as the team's weapons expert well, as opposed to brute strength or crafty business. So, what does the show decide to do for this character, whose mind is supposed to be his greatest strength? Make him a dumb little bitch for the whole episode, of course. Seriously, why didn't he approach any of this stuff better? Why didn't he say something other than immediate agreement to his dad's invitation? Why didn't he try to escape at any point? Why didn't he try and warn his wife or boss of his father's psychotic behavior? Why did he let himself get kidnapped despite it being extremely obvious that that was what was going to happen? Why does he never communicate with Millie despite their relationship being portrayed as oh so perfect by the creators of the show? Why is he so dumb for this whole episode? You can't even make the argument that he's too scared of his dad because he still doesn't communicate with Millie when they're alone and still doesn't try to do anything that night to escape despite having hours on end alone to plan. They did the same shit last episode and I can't stand it. They are wiping away one of the best characters of the show and nobody seems to care. This is my least favorite part of the whole episode, the complete emasculation of Moxie. I know that Moxie has been like the ass end of every joke since day one of this show, but for the love of God, at least keep him responding the same way to the mockery the whole time. Anyways, what's going on? Oh yeah, Crimson talking to Moxie. So he keeps him back after dinner and tells him, I was lying actually, you're being forced to marry Chaz so we can get into the family tomorrow. He also bitch slaps him, showing that he's physically abusive as well. But I have a hard time taking any of that seriously, because 2 seconds later, the show does one of the most hilarious but also stupidest things it's done in its entire run. This scene is completely and utterly ridiculous, but that's what makes it so amazing. Under any other context, I would praise this scene as a fine example of absurdist comedy and move on. But unfortunately, I instead have to shame it for its ludicrously bad timing. You see, dropped right in the middle of this sex toy extravaganza, we're given Moxie's tragic backstory about his childhood, where he's forced to shoot living prisoners of war for target practice, and he watches his father murder his mother via drowning. Yeah, I think someone should introduce the show writers to the concept of tonal whiplash. Both of these scenes, the backstory and the absurdist comedy bit, are very well done on their own. I personally love Moxie's backstory. It's dark, it's tragic, it's sad, it shows us why he's afraid of his father. It's great in all those regards. However, both are immensely dragged down by their timing. I mean, they're two completely different tones, and they very noticeably clash with each other and cheapen both. You can definitely have both in an episode and make it work, but not in this close proximity. It just makes the whole thing seem stupid. The character assassination of Moxie continues in the next scene, where he completely ignores his chance to finally clue Millie in on what's going on. We see later in the episode that Millie has literally no problem tearing through Crimson's entire army of goons, and Moxie damn well knows she can already do that. So if he had told her here that his father was completely insane and threatened to send both of them home in boxes at this moment, she could have just done her rampage then and prevented this whole thing from happening. But that solution would be way too easy. Then the episode kicks the insanity into an even higher gear by having Chaz try and seduce Moxie with a
sexually charged musical number.
Yeah, this scene isn't funny and is just a complete waste of time, plain and simple. It's reaching way too hard for a laugh, and that makes it more unfunny than anything else. I already thought that this show kind of leaned a little bit too much into haha sex funny kind of jokes, and I think that this scene is a good example of why. On top of all of that, it's Chaz. I already didn't like Chaz, so the fact that he's the one singing makes this scene much, much worse. I know that I'm complaining a lot about a scene that's only a minute long, but it's still unnecessary and I still hate it. Also, it keeps going after Moxie kicks him out. Chaz then tries to seduce Millie to the amount of success that you'd expect, and then successfully seduces Blitz because he's Blitz. They then sleep together, and Blitz roots around in his stuff and finds out that he was lying about being wealthy and is actually broke, and was trying to get rich by marrying into the family. Before he can do anything with that information, however, Chaz drugs him and stuffs him in his trunk, and then he says his only mildly humorous line in the entire episode.
Sorry, babe, you aren't the only junk in my trunk. Damn it, that is not a good one.
After this, we cut to the next day, which is also the ending portion of the episode. So the next morning, Millie goes to look for Blitz, and Moxie finally stands up to his dad a little, telling him that he's refusing to marry Chaz. This moment is actually pretty good and would make a satisfying conclusion of Moxie's arc of overcoming his fear of his father, but the show decides to once again make Moxie the fool by having him get tased and held against his will. What makes this even sadder is that this happens immediately following this line.
You'll learn firsthand just how good I've gotten at my job.
The show writers are just making very confusing decisions as of late. Is Moxie actually supposed to be good at his job, or is he just comic relief? This is a question that's been on my mind since the last episode, where Moxie was relegated to an unimportant side character for the whole episode, and had his IQ knocked down a few points to facilitate that storyline. This show just can't help itself when it comes to undermining Moxie. You know what would have been great? If this scene had played out exactly the same, up until the point where he gets taken down. But instead of getting kidnapped, Moxie anticipates getting tased and attacks this bodyguard guy, maybe with some kind of karate move, or he pulls a gun out of a hidden holster or something like that. Then, Moxie is the one who fights his way through Crimson's house, using his accurate shooting or hand-to-hand combat to defeat his dad's army of thugs, maybe saving his wife and boss in the process. Would that not have been so much better than another Millie killing everything montage? Would that ending that I just described not have given more substance to Moxie, the character this episode is supposed to be centered around? The fact that this show undercuts everything about Moxie is one of my least favorite things about it. Anyways, what actually happens instead? Moxie gets immediately kidnapped and Millie frees Blitz while Moxie is dragged to the altar in chains. They recycle the dildo joke again, and Blitz fills Millie in on what he found out about Chaz, including that Moxie is being forced to marry him. This is the beginning of Millie's rampage, where she rips through all of Crimson's henchmen in an attempt to stop the wedding. Now, despite everything I just said about this ending retroactively weakening Moxie's character, I still think it's cool, of course. It can't be denied that Helluva Boss has some incredible fight scenes, like in episode 6, and this one fits right into that lineup. Also, as previously mentioned, the original song playing in the background is actually really great and elevates the entire sequence.
You tried to take him like you didn't know. Try and take it, now reap what you sow.
This is probably the first Helluva boss song I've actively enjoyed since episode 7. Crimson's yelling in the background was pretty funny too.
What the fuck is the matter with you? Why do I hate you? Get her!
Although it does make me wonder why he wasn't trying to finish the marriage while Millie was distracted though. I mean, the grooms and officiator were still there, so he could have at least tried to make his plan work. Anyways, this fight scene also gives us the explanation for yet another trailer scene. One of Millie's only scenes in the entire trailer is her ripping apart some guys, and now we know who those guys were. I think that this scene was actually a good one to include in the trailer, unlike Chaz's inclusion from earlier, which was just a waste because he dies in the end. Spoilers, by the way. This scene concludes with Millie rescuing Moxie, and Moxie telling Crimson the truth about Chaz not being rich. As I just said, this would lead to Crimson killing him, which we see a few scenes later. Rest in piss, you obnoxious piece of shit. One of my least favorite characters so far in the entire show. I'm actually really happy that he was one off. Afterwards, we get a quick scene of IMP reconvening, and then we see Crimson again. We see that he killed Chaz, and then he throws a knife at a portrait of Moxie, implying that he's after him now. I would be concerned about this, but at this point the IMP has made like 10 different enemies, and nothing has ever come of it throughout the entire show, so I don't really care about this all that much. I'm hoping that at some point the IMP have to deal with their past enemies, because I'm getting kind of sick of all these villains being shown as if they're going to be threats and then never appearing in the show again. So that's it. That's the whole episode. In my humble opinion, this one was probably the weakest episode of Season 2 thus far, and one of the weaker episodes of the show as a whole. Now don't get me wrong, the episode isn't painfully bad or anything, it's just average, maybe a bit below. There is some stuff I liked, some stuff I didn't. I would say that there's a little bit more stuff in here that I didn't like than did, though. I kind of feel like this episode could have been done a lot differently. Could have been shorter if it was more streamlined, it could have been more enjoyable without all the unnecessary scenes and characters, it could have made more sense if the scenes were reordered, and it could have been better for the characters if Moxie wasn't made into such a little bitch. So with all that in mind, 6.5 out of 10. It fits comfortably between the pilot and Nazi's. For reference on this specific tier list, I would say that 7 is an average. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share this video around. Bye.